San Diego, California, 1980. Police respond to an emergency call from an apartment in the suburb of Santee. The frightened caller says her roommate, Michelle Wyatt, is dead in the living room.
It was pretty gruesome because there was a telephone cord around her neck. Her gown was open. The living room was in disarray, and somebody had dumped the contents of her purse into the toilet.
Michelle is a beautiful and popular young woman with a large group of friends.
Everybody loved Michelle. Men wanted to date her and women wanted to be like her. So in my mind, it could have been anybody.
The initial investigation fails to find her killer. 40 years later, new forensic science could be able to identify the man who sex attacked and murdered this beautiful young woman, Michelle Wyatt. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Bloodline Detectives. It's 1980. Michelle Wyatt is a student at Grossmont College, about 20 minutes outside San Diego.
So Michelle Wyatt was a 20-year-old young lady who had a lot of different interests in life. She was known to be very active. She enjoyed things like scuba diving. She liked running. She was a big reader. She was very beautiful. She had blonde hair, great smile, very bubbly personality, just the type of girl that others might be jealous of.
Well, I met Michelle when both of our families moved into our neighborhood, and we just lived a couple houses away from each other and just became fast friends. Michelle was a very outgoing person. She was very kind, very friendly, made friends very easily. She really made a friend with whoever she ran into. She had aspirations. She wanted to go into something that included her love for drawing. She was an artist. She was really good at everything she did and loved doing it. She was really living her best life.
October 8, Michelle makes plans to hang out that evening with her boyfriend.
Michelle and Pat had worked together at the Safeway store, and Michelle caught Pat's attention. She's this beautiful young lady. She's got this beautiful hair, big bright smile, and Michelle and Pat seemed to really hit it off. It was almost love at first sight for them.
I remember Mrs. Wyatt telling me that Michelle really liked Patrick, and her mom even teased her, "You're going to get married sometime soon?" And Michelle goes, "Oh, come on, Mom, but I think he's the one."
Around 9:00 p.m., Michelle and Pat went back into Michelle's condo where the two of them watched TV, spent some time together. And then around 12:45 a.m., Pat decided to leave. He wasn't going to stay the night at Michelle's. He had an early day at work the next day on October 9th. So around 12:45, Pat kisses his girlfriend goodbye.
The very next day, Michelle Wyatt's roommate, Rita, returns home in the afternoon.
The roommate opened the door and immediately saw Michelle. Michelle was right there in the living room just past the door, and she was clearly dead.
When the detectives arrived, they processed the crime scene. They discovered a telephone had been kind of pulled out of the wall, and the cord was wrapped around Michelle's neck, along with a part of a towel. That towel matched another towel in the kitchen. Her purse had been dumped out on the floor, and the purse was actually thrown into the toilet in the downstairs bathroom.
It was clear that this was not a planned event because the things that he used to kill her were from the apartment. He did not bring anything into the apartment. It's not clear that he left with anything. He used what he could find from the apartment to strangle her. It was a brutal murder for sure.
In the meantime, Michelle's mother had been notified, Louise, who was just a lovely woman. Police wouldn't let anybody inside the condo. She wanted to know what was going on, and the police just said, look, we're not going to tell you anything right now, just we're investigating what's going on. She goes, well, I want to see my daughter. And they said, you've got to stay outside and we'll tell you. And I believe at some point they did tell her that her daughter was dead, but she wasn't allowed to go into the room because they were intent on preserving evidence. That was their number one priority. It's a terrible way to find out.
About 11:45, and my mom called me into the living room and said that she had seen a blurb for the 11 o'clock news that a 20-year-old girl was murdered in Santee. And I did not even think of her. So we all gathered in the living room and they confirmed that it was her. And I just remember looking at the TV thinking, as they showed video of her condo, and thinking if it's not her condo, then they have the wrong person. And unfortunately, I recognized the condo. I remember my family sitting in the living room, and I remember looking around the room at everybody's face, and I remember specifically my brother's face because they were all looking at me, and the shock and fear. I mean, I still remember their faces. So we walked down to the Wyatts, and all I could do was tell them how sorry I was. I didn't know in that moment, it broke me for a long time. There was a lot of shock and anger, and my brain just couldn't wrap around it, and it never could. I ended up turning to drugs and alcohol to try to deal with the anguish, and then knew at a point that very shortly before my daughter was born that that had to stop, that it had to stop, that I had to live my life, that's what she would have wanted for me.
While Michelle Wyatt's family and friends cope with a devastating loss, Michelle's body taken for autopsy.
They did a sexual assault exam. They collected semen, saliva, and biological fluids that were on her.
It's clear from the evidence from what was found at the scene that she fought this attack based on some of the defensive wounds that were found.
The autopsy also revealed that in addition to being strangled, Michelle had also suffered blunt force trauma, particularly to the left side of her head. She had significant bleeding and bruising to the left side, as well as a swollen left eye. Based on the evidence collected at the autopsy, the medical examiner theorized that Michelle had been murdered sometime between 1:00 a.m. and 2:00 a.m. on October 9th.
She was murdered in a condominium complex that had a lot of people living in it. So very quickly, they fanned out to the complex to talk to the residents to see if they saw something. Did they hear something? Did they know who lived there? Did they have some relationship with Michelle Wyatt and her roommate? And then you get bits of information, and then that takes you somewhere else potentially to figure out who may have been responsible for doing that.
The autopsy is complete. Michelle Wyatt was brutally raped before she was strangled dead. Now, detectives from San Diego Sheriff's Office try to piece together Michelle's last movements. That's next on Bloodline Detectives. "1980, Santee, California, a suburb of San Diego. the body of 20-year-old college student Michelle Wyatt, discovered by her female roommate. Michelle, the victim of a brutal sex attack and murder.
According to two different neighbors of Michelle's, they heard two of her dogs barking as well as some screaming coming from the direction of Michelle's condo. But neither one of the neighbors didn't seem to raise that much alarm in the neighbors' minds that something was wrong. And neither neighbor decided to pick up the phone and call the investigators. They heard the dogs barking and thought that nothing was wrong. They maybe didn't want to get involved, and the neighbors went to sleep that night.
Police canvassed the area, and doing so, they find and interview a neighbor who can place Michelle Wyatt's boyfriend at Michelle's apartment.
Teddy was a neighbor of Michelle and Rita's who lived across the street from their condo. And when police sat down and spoke with Teddy, he provided some interesting information. Teddy told investigators that he had seen Michelle's boyfriend's car parked outside the condo that night. And when the police asked him for any more details, he really didn't provide much more information. He just said that Michelle's boyfriend was there, he saw the car parked out front, and when he went to bed that night, Pat's car was still there.
I don't think anybody saw the boyfriend's car leave, which of course, made him appear even more suspicious to everybody, especially since the murder happened so close to the time that he did leave. But he was pretty soon crossed off the list as the #1 suspect based on his reaction to Michelle's murder and based on his cooperation with the police. He was an open book. He was very, very open. And veteran detectives always have a bit of a feeling. They can tell sometimes if somebody is guilty or if somebody is not, and they're not always right. But in this case, everybody who interviewed him and everybody in the sheriff's department had the feeling that this is not our guy.
I never thought that Michelle's boyfriend had anything to do with it. And I know that they did look at him, but I don't think they looked at him for very long. And she was so comfortable around him and really thought that this was going to be the one. And there was never any anger. She never talked about there was no reason. There was no reason that he would have done it.
Detectives focus attention on one of Michelle Wyatt's co-workers there at the Safeway where Michelle has a part-time job.
The reason why this colleague of Michelle's became a suspect was because Michelle had shared with several people that this coworker of hers kind of gave her the creeps. She was kind of freaked out by this guy. So when investigators found this out, they thought that he might have had something to do with her murder.
He really liked Michelle and was trying to date her, and she wasn't interested. And during the investigation, they discovered he had driven by her house a few times, just checking to see if she was home, he said, and so they kind of focused on him.
When investigators asked him about his alibi or where he was on the night of Michelle's murder, he sort of came up with two different stories. Originally, Michelle's coworker said that he was at home with his dad that night, but then his story seemed to change a little bit, and he wasn't at home with his dad. He then said that he was on a date with another woman. So investigators were a little bit suspicious of Michelle's coworker, but they really didn't have any solid evidence linking him to any crime.
A case like this is very difficult because you can kind of get tunnel vision. You can sort of go down a path because you're convinced yourself that it had to have been this person. And so you end up spending a lot of investigative time going down certain rabbit holes because you've kind of convinced yourself or others have convinced you that this person had to have been responsible. And at some point, he was excluded.
Everybody loved Michelle. Men wanted to date her and women wanted to be like her. I mean, it just was. And so everybody was kind of a suspect. So I gave them as much information as I could. I had my fingerprints done just to exclude me and her from fingerprints in the condominium. You know, talked about who I had seen over there and who she was the closest to. I probably bothered them quite a bit because somebody somewhere knew something.
And we know, for instance, in most homicides, the victim and the suspect know each other. She was very popular, and there were young men at that time who were interested in her, interested in dating her, people who didn't date her but may have wanted to. So all those people were investigated. Perhaps it was somebody who was spurned by Michelle. So all those things were looked into in the early part of the investigation, but even as that investigation got turned over to other detectives, there was still a look into excluding, to the extent that we could, all the individuals that were connected possibly with this case.
The family took things into their own hands, and Louise Wyatt had flyers printed up, thousands of flyers, who killed my daughter, with Michelle's picture, and they were plastered all over Santee and all over the surrounding neighborhoods. They hired a private investigator. Louise was very frustrated with the lack of progress that the police were making. She and her husband both felt that it should be a #1 priority, but in all fairness, the police, they didn't have any more information.
In Michelle's case, she had originally 5 detectives solely assigned to her case. But as the weeks and months went by, several of these full-time investigators were moved off of Michelle's case. Unfortunately, there were other crimes happening. There were other murders happening in Santee and the surrounding areas. And as these newer cases came in, several of these detectives were unfortunately moved off Michelle's case, and they were assigned new ones.
The investigation is also limited by the lack of forensic science techniques available at the time.
At the time of Michelle's murder in 1980, DNA testing and forensic testing was nowhere near where it is today. But luckily, investigators in Michelle's case, they had the idea in their head that DNA and forensic testing was evolving, and even if they might not be able to test the evidence today, they had the knowledge to at least collect the evidence and store it so that future testing could be done when DNA testing was growing and was advancing. So the original investigators in 1980 collected valuable forensic evidence from Michelle's body, particularly from her rape kit, where investigators were able to pull semen DNA evidence from Michelle's body. And in 1996, when Michelle's case was reopened, investigators sent the semen evidence to a lab to be tested. And from that sample, investigators generated a DNA profile.
They entered the DNA into CODIS, which is a national database, and they got no match. That doesn't mean that the person who did it had never done anything, but it did mean that the person who killed Michelle had no criminal record. So they were looking at somebody who had never been caught for anything.
Michelle Wyatt's rapist and killer continues to evade justice. His trail goes cold. Next on Bloodline Detectives, a new decade, new forensic science, and new investigators bring hope Michelle's case could be solved. 1996, San Diego suburbs, Santee, California. Cold case detectives investigating the 1980 rape and murder of a 20-year-old student, Michelle Wyatt. Now, they're pinning their hopes on DNA technology, which is emerging as a very powerful investigative tool.
After the search through the CODIS database turned up empty in 1996, the investigation once again turned cold. And the case didn't really pick up again until 4 years later in 2000. They conducted a more advanced DNA test on the semen sample and as well as Michelle's sexual assault kit. And when they tested the results, investigators discovered that there were 2 male profiles within Michelle's sexual assault kit. One of the male DNA profiles belonged to Michelle's boyfriend, Pat. And this was key information in the investigation because this officially ruled out Michelle's boyfriend in the murder. What was also interesting was that investigators found a second male DNA profile, and this profile didn't belong to Michelle's boyfriend, and it didn't belong to anyone else that the police had considered in the investigation. This testing in 2000 also was able to officially rule out Michelle's coworker. He was officially excluded as the contributor of the unknown male DNA in 2000. So this testing seemed to really eliminate everyone and left one unknown male DNA profile that still needed to be identified.
Detectives getting closer and closer to identifying a killer, but they still need a breakthrough to crack this case. Their hopes are raised when they learn of a revolutionary new technique, forensic genetic genealogy.
We started hearing a lot of buzz that departments in the FBI were using genealogy to solve cases where there was DNA evidence, but no clear link to any individual. A lot of us in the unit kind of said, well, we can do that. We realized that when you're in trying to discover the mysteries of your family, really not much different than trying to discover the mysteries of a homicide. And so we decided early on to do the genealogy part in-house. Most of the departments that solve these cases farm out their genealogy to professional genealogists who are tremendous at their jobs. And we thought, who better than the people who are actually closest to the case? And it got the attention of the command staff, and so they decided to fund us a bit so that, you know, the money that we would need to have DNA profiles created, the tools that we would need to do the genealogy, they were willing to fund it. And it was on that, it was subsequent to that, that we took a look at Michelle Wyatt's case. And this case was assigned to Detective Brian Patterson. And Detective Patterson is from Santee. He's always taken a great interest, a personal interest in this case. And this was his first investigative genetic genealogy case.
When genetic genealogy came about, our unit started reviewing cases and trying to find cases that were suitable for that. One, you have to have DNA left. You can't use the old profiles. It's an entirely different system or way of obtaining a profile. And Michelle Wyatt's case was one of those where there was still DNA, and we were able to get enough DNA and send it off to a company called Gene by Gene, who gives us the snippet to put into genetic genealogy. And then we use GEDmatch to kind of start our investigation.
The results they received back from GEDmatch generated over 1,000 potential relatives related to Michelle's killer. They got a lot of hits from GEDmatch on who their suspect might be. As soon as investigators got the list of potential matches, they got to work on creating family trees. They wanted to identify as many people as possible who could be Michelle's killer. And from these family trees, investigators were able to identify a female relative of Michelle's killer that, through genetic genealogy, investigators discovered was most likely a first cousin of Michelle's killer.
They find 3 brothers. One of them kind of raised their suspicions a little bit. His name was Rusty. His DNA is so close, he's got to be the father or the uncle of the killer. How do we find out what happened here? And they go back and they interview, the cousin who had led them, through DNA to this person. She goes, yeah, I remember him, but I don't think he had any kids. None of them have a male offspring, at least that they know about, who's traceable.
Forensic genetic genealogy is built around identifying DNA found at a crime scene and then linking that DNA to a suspect. Once they find that match, Bloodline Detectives must then go through the tedious task of eliminating innocent family members to find the guilty one. And that's what happens here. Rusty Howard and his male relatives become people of interest in a murder case. Now, the challenge is to remove the innocent relatives and identify one single suspect.
He's a genealogist's nightmare because he was a drifter. He had a number of marriages, but being a drifter, he just didn't have a lot of solid information, other than the fact that we learned a lot about his wives, but we didn't think that he had ever had any children with any of his wives. And we discovered an individual that was related to Rusty. We called this individual up, and he was a retired law enforcement officer from Texas. And I'll never forget when we were talking to him about his family, and he always knew that his father that he was raised with was not his birth father, but he didn't know anything about his birth father. But I remember one thing he said to me, well, every cotton patch has at least one boll weevil. But we discovered who his father was, who his birth father was, and his birth father was Rusty. So because we now had this individual identified as had fathered this one person, well, we knew that this person was not our suspect. But as we discovered he was related to our suspect through Rusty, we realized Rusty is the father of our suspect, who is the mother.
Investigators dig deeper into the family's background. They discover the suspect's mother turns out to be a woman named Betty White.
We were able to put together how Betty and Rusty most likely got together. Rusty was a carpenter. We discovered through interviews with people who knew him that he had worked on some Hollywood sets. We know that he was in Arizona in the early 60s, that he worked on the set of the movie How the West Was Won, which was a big movie back in the early 60s, a Western. And then we also discovered, as we sort of learned more about the maternal side of the family, that the suspect's mother was on the set at that time also, either as an extra or one of her kids at the time was an extra of the movie. Since both of those individuals are deceased, we can't go to them for confirmation. But that seemed a likely place for them to have potentially met up. But Rusty, being the drifter, was, to the extent that we could tell, never involved in the suspect's life. And in fact, the suspect was raised with a different last name than Rusty's and was raised as the child of this other man. Whether that other man knew that his son was not his biologically, we don't know, but he was raised as the son of this man. We discovered very quickly that she had a son named John Patrick Hogan. As soon as we learned his identity, that was the individual that we focused on. You focus on until there's a reason not to focus on the individual. And as we dove deeper into John Patrick Hogan's life, every element, or almost every element of his life, lined up with Michelle Wyatt's murder.
Thousands of relatives have been eliminated. Now, narrowing down the search to one prime suspect. His name, John Patrick Hogan. Next on Bloodline Detectives, police now need solid evidence to secure a conviction. 40 years after the 1980 sex attack and murder of a young college student, Michelle Wyatt, San Diego detectives are so close to cracking the case. They identify a single suspect, John Patrick Hogan, by use of forensic genetic genealogy. But now they've got to find him.
We learned a lot about his life from about age 15 to age 20. We also discovered at the time that he was in high school, he lived in the same condominium complex that Michelle lived in when she was murdered.
Teddy was a neighbor who they had interviewed early on in the first stage of the investigation in 1980. And when they talked to him again 20 years later and they mentioned John Patrick Hogan, Teddy said, "Yeah, I knew him. In fact, he came over. He was over. He lived around here. We were friends. We palled around." So the theory is that he must have seen Michelle. He might even have played pool with her and her boyfriend at some point. But whatever happened, he got Michelle in his head.
At the time that Michelle was murdered, he was an active member of the U.S. Air Force, active duty member of the Air Force, and was stationed in New Mexico. That gave us a bit of a red flag because we're like, well, how can we account for him potentially doing this if he was active duty in New Mexico? But we were able to get his service records. And the service records gave us an extraordinary amount of detail regarding his military life. And one of the things that we learned about Hogan is that he was on leave the week that Michelle was murdered.
Investigators believe they are so close to catching a killer, Michelle Wyatt's killer. As police zero in on the whereabouts of John Patrick Hogan, they make a discovery that threatens to blow up the investigation.
Tracking John Patrick Hogan down was going to be difficult for investigators because they quickly learned that at the time they discovered his name, he was already deceased. He was no longer living. So investigators couldn't reach out and speak with Hogan directly to see if he had anything to do with Michelle's murder.
What was chilling about learning about his death was that he died on the exact day that he had killed Michelle Wyatt 24 years earlier. And when we sort of realized that, it gave all of us serious goosebumps because we realized, okay, there are 365 potential days in which you could die, and for you to happen to die on the death anniversary of your victim was just stunned us. We were fortunate though, he had died of either of a meth overdose or a heart attack that came as a result of meth use. An autopsy was done in Phoenix, and the medical examiner's office in Phoenix still had the blood card from John Patrick Hogan. This was incredibly significant because we didn't have access to his remains. I think he was cremated, so we were not able to exhume his body to make a one-to-one comparison. But the blood card would tell us definitively if the DNA from the scene matched the DNA from John Patrick Hogan that was collected at the scene of his death. And it was a 100% match.
Even a dead suspect may not be able to escape Bloodline Detectives and their forensic weapons. That's next. It's been 40 years since the brutal sex assault and murder of a beautiful college co-ed, Michelle Wyatt. Bloodline Detectives using forensic genetic genealogy to give a name to her killer, John Patrick Hogan. As they close in on finding Hogan, the investigation falls flat, deflated, when police discover the suspect is dead.
So once we found out that John Hogan was deceased, it's kind of a letdown. I mean, you really want to make this person pay for what they did, and knowing they've gotten away with it all these years. But it's also nice to know that we finally give the family some closure and give them answers. They've gone years and years without knowing what happened. We never really get to know exactly what happened. The only way that would have been done, been able to be found out, is if he was alive and he told us. Fortunately, they don't generally tell us everything, suspects, they kind of lie. But we can put it together, the pieces, as best as we can, and then at least explain to the family that we found who killed your daughter. I called her mom, I called her best friend, and I said, okay, we need to meet at your house. And they brought relatives and friends, and I have some news to tell you. And we just sat down in the living room and told them what we had discovered. They really wanted to face the person that killed their daughter, but that wasn't going to happen, unfortunately, for them. And we just tell them, and they're happy, but come to find out, it doesn't give you the closure that you're really hoping for. Because, again, we can't explain to them exactly what happened. I can tell you what the evidence says. I can show you why we determined it was Hogan, and that's all I can do, because I don't have the ability to talk to him, obviously.
For a very long time, John Patrick Hogan might have thought that he had gotten away with the perfect murder. This was back in 1980. Hogan was only 18 years old, and for many years, for decades, he might have thought that he was going to get away with sexually assaulting and murdering Michelle. And for many years, he was right. He was able to evade law enforcement for decades until advancements in DNA testing and the use of genetic genealogy was used to ultimately catch him. And I think without genetic genealogy, he might have gotten away with it. Without the advancements in DNA testing, we might not ever know the name John Patrick Hogan in connection with Michelle's murder. So it's really all thanks to genetic genealogy and the advancements that we have that can ultimately solve these decades-old cold cases and eventually bring these perpetrators to justice.
Especially the larger police departments may be in a position to do this work themselves. And even though our unit is at least a little unique in that we do all of this IGG work in-house, our hope is that other police departments might be able to do the same thing. We are not interested in you per se, only interested in learning the identity of suspects. And the more people that are willing to do that, the more cases that we're going to be able to close. For people who have committed terrible crimes and nobody has paid any attention to them, my message to them is your time is coming and your time may be up.
I think that the use of genetic genealogy was our only hope in having Michelle's murder solved, because he was not on anybody's radar. Nobody would have ever known. And I think it brings hope to all the families out there who still don't know. I feel like I have a purpose to keep her memory alive. I love to talk about her. I love to share stories of times that her and I spent together. I've named my daughter after her. I like to come down to the beach on anniversaries and stuff and just sit and look out at the ocean. It was one of her favorite places. So I feel close to her there. I know that Michelle had a tradition of giving her mom flowers every Mother's Day, and I have kept that tradition alive over the years. And I have also become an advocate for our local rape crisis center. And one of the first things I tell the victims when they come in is if they're doubting their part, I should have screamed. I said, you know what? You're here and you're alive, so you did everything right.
In a bizarre twist, John Patrick Hogan dies of a drug overdose exactly 24 years to the day he raped and murdered Michelle Wyatt. His identity as her killer proves that today, not even dead suspects can escape their crimes. That's because of incredible work of investigators and scientists who are the Bloodline Detectives. Their incredible achievements are redefining the phrase, justice is served. I'm Nancy Grace. Thanks for joining us here on Bloodline Detectives.